Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Trek Politics. I'm Mary Trump here with my friend and co-host Bob Cesca. Hey, Bob, how are you?
Hey, Mary, doing great. Looking forward to this episode.
Yeah, me too. We have as our special guest today Mike Sussman, who was on our panel with us at Star Trek Las Vegas, the Trek Politics panel. And Mike brings a fascinating perspective. So we had a chance to talk to him about an Enterprise episode, Detained, and also a project that he's working on, which we're both very excited about. So tell us a little bit about the episode.
Yes, Detained. We're talking about this episode from Enterprise. It's season 1, episode 21, in which Archer and Mayweather wake up in a Tandaran internment camp imprisoned with Suliban detainees. And as we'll discuss, it features the reunion of Scott Bakula and his Quantum Leap co-star Dean Stockwell. In terms of allegory, Detained calls to mind the Japanese internment camps from World War II, and sadly, the mass deportation camps that we're seeing right damn now. It was directed by the great David Livingston, who I got a chance to meet at Star Trek Las Vegas this past year, with the story by Rick Berman and Brannon Braga, teleplay by our guest today, Mike Sussman and Phyllis Strong. And so today we're going to talk with co-writer Mike Sussman about this episode and about his pitch for Star Trek United, which we're super psyched about. Hopefully it's going to be developed into a series by Paramount Skydance. Mike worked on 23 episodes, Mary, of Voyager, 41 episodes of Enterprise. Plus he joined us, as you said, on the Trek Politics panel at this year's Star Trek Las Vegas, which the Inglorious Treksperts have that episode now up on their podcast feed, so you can check it out there. Really looking forward to talking with Mike today.
Me too. So let's dive in.
Incoming transmission.
Politics. I'm not good at politics. Surely there are others who are better suited.
Trek Politics with Mary L. Trump and Bob Cesca.
Mike, so happy to have you here for any number of reasons, starting with Star Trek United. But I mean, before we get into all of that, I want to thank you once again for joining us on the politics panel at Star Trek Las Vegas this year. It was quite a prestigious panel, and you certainly made it that and a whole lot more. So thank you again for coming on to the stage with us on the Trekspert stage and talking some Star Trek politics. It was a real blast, wasn't it?
Well, thank you.
It was incredible.
Yeah, that was, and listening to, so many luminaries from throughout, the whole modern science fiction world, from, Ronald Moore to Mary McConnell, who I was sitting next to, and getting her perspective on what, her character on Battlestar Galactica, I thought was really interesting how she seemed to differ with some of the decisions that Laura Rosalind had made on that show, which I got a real kick out of hearing. But that was a great panel. It was a lot of fun.
It really was. But we wanted to start off by talking about an episode of Enterprise that you were very involved in.
Yes.
So, Bob, if you want to kick that off, because I think, as is so often the case, there are a lot of parallels to things that are happening now, but also parallels among the different iterations of Star Trek, which are really fascinating.
Absolutely. This episode is allegorical, as is mentioned by Captain Archer in the episode, to the Japanese internment camps from World War II. And so from a writer's approach, was there any consideration at the time, because this episode aired April 2002 or so, and those of us here in the United States recognize that specifically as the beginning months of the War on Terror and the post 9/11 era. Was there any consideration to that period of time as you were writing this episode and thinking about things like indefinite detention and so forth, people being wrongfully imprisoned, or was it more specific to the World War II era and the Japanese internment?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways it was both, but it was definitely something that was very much on the mind of all of us in the writers' room and people throughout the country. The treatment of Muslim Americans. It was a very difficult time for a lot of people for so many reasons, and so this was a story that had been written by our showrunners, Brannon Braga and Rick Berman, And my writing partner at the time, Phyllis, and I were basically handed the outline and fleshed it out into a teleplay. It's interesting because, as you, Bob, pointed out, we actually directly bring up in the episode, we have Captain Archer point out what they're experiencing and seeing on this planet, where this enemy race, the Suliban, who we establish are, very early on in the pilot episode, sort of our villain of the series. And they're involved with these not really time traveling, but time communicating villains who are giving them advanced technology and allowing them to genetically engineer. So we find, this whole planet, basically, this whole prison colony of people who Archer and the audience are anticipating that these people are villains, because the only people of this race we've met have tried to attack us and have been very belligerent. And this is something Star Trek does very wonderfully. It will take a character, a race, a species, establish them as a villain, and then at some point turn it on its ear and make us realize that they're not all of one belief or one system, and that there's a lot of complexity there. I liked that exploration of that complexity and the compassion. And if we could also somehow comment on what was going on in the world at that moment in the treatment of Muslim Americans, and maybe perhaps make people think twice about what was going on. And were we going down the similar path that we did during World War II with the Japanese internment camps? Let's not have that happen again. Maybe an episode like this was sort of in the back of our minds, might help people to think about this subject in a way that is, again, kind of a safe space. Think of it as an allegory and not, necessarily have to think about that, tragic day in September that was still so fresh in everybody's mind. So I think generally that was the goal. It was great fun to have Dean Stockwell guest on the show. We were certainly happy to have him join us and reunite him with Scott on screen. Part of me does wonder if it was a little bit of a missed opportunity, because they had it was fun to see them in an antagonistic relationship. I wouldn't have minded a different type of relationship, maybe more like the one they had on Quantum Leap. Yeah. But it was great to have him on the show. All of that said, I think the episode doesn't quite succeed dramatically. And I think when a show like that, which, aspires to, say something and say it in a way that is hopefully not pretentious, sometimes the entertainment can get lost. And I feel that episode was not as entertaining as it perhaps could have been.
Well, Mike, that's a really good point. And Bob and I talk about this a lot. We like the old school original series approach, the Next Generation approach of diplomacy and having long, detailed conversations about things and working things through and being philosophical. So, if history rhymes, so too does Star Trek. And we do see this as a challenge. But I mean, I thought the episode was successful because it wasn't as on the nose as Star Trek can be sometimes, particularly in the original series. And it did make the point that sometimes the best way to solve something is to give it time and space and have serious conversations and listen respectfully and all that. So what often happens in Star Trek is that whether the episode succeeds all the way dramatically or not, it operates on many different levels. It is historically grounded, and as we've discovered, it is also prescient in ways that many shows aren't. So how do you make the calculation? Because sometimes drama is sacrificed for making the point, so to speak.
I don't know if you're familiar with a documentary, Hearts of Darkness, a filmmaker's Apocalypse.
Yes.
Made by, or Bob, you're familiar with it?
Absolutely. Made by Apocalypse Now.
Yeah, it's incredible.
It's really incredible. And there's a moment where Eleanor caught her husband, Francis Ford Coppola, going a little nutso in the jungle, and he was just struggling with this movie he was trying to make. And he had this wonderful, just impromptu speech about how you want to make a movie that says something that is important, but you don't want to be pretentious. And if you do it the wrong way, everyone's going to come down on you like a ton of bricks for being pretentious. Yet if you take out the meaning of the movie and you just now have a war picture that's an action movie, well, now you've just made a popcorn film. And he was just really struggling with that. And I think that is the struggle with certainly with television and film, and I'm sure in other art forms as well. What is that balance? I mean, as Bob pointed out in that particular episode, Detained, we have Archer point out in the episode, which is kind of unusual for a lot of reasons, because normally you're doing something as an allegory that the audience will recognize, but we have the character recognizing the parallels to the World War II internment of Japanese Americans. And it might be worth pointing out, in the earlier version of the script, we needed a name, for instance. Well, we had the Suliban; they were an established villain, and we needed a name for these for this species that they were living in their space. This is the same species that Dean Stockwell was a part of. And I was playing around with words, and I came up with an alien species name, which was Mazarite, which sounded a little like Manzanar. And everyone really loved the name. In fact, we ended up taking it out of this episode and putting it in another one. However, so the name for the alien race, Mazarites, dropped out when I believe it was Brandon decided to add in this little speech from Archer, which is actually one of my favorite moments in the show, even though it's potentially very on the nose. But it was almost sort of silly for Archer to not realize it and point it out. So when he starts talking about Manzanar, it didn't make any sense to have those aliens called the Mazarites anymore. It was a little too close. So I think they're called the Tandarans now. But yeah, it is a constant struggle. Like how is this allegory working? It's a little bit like working backwards from like a theme. You can be given a theme for a story or a movie, a TV episode, and then try and engineer plot points and characters that will bring that theme to light. For me, anyway, more often than not, that is a path to a not a great script or a great story, because you often don't know what theme you're exploring until you set out to actually write it. I mean, the very first story that I sold for Star Trek, my first professional sale, was an episode called Meld for Voyager. And that was one of the few times in my life where I've actually been able to reverse engineer a sort of a theme. I was given a theme. I was just an intern on the show at the time. And the showrunner, the great Michael Piller, had wanted to do a story. And he put this theme out to the whole writing staff. And I think he was kind of frustrated because no one was bringing him a story that examined this theme. And the theme was mindless violence, but through the analysis of Tuvok, the Vulcan character on the show. And so, I realized, like, well, this was a golden opportunity for me as a brand new writer. And I came up with a story, and it ended up being, I ended up just writing that initial story document, and Michael wrote the teleplay. But it was really ended up being a wonderful exploration of this character, Tuvok, who could not understand mindless violence, that he was always looking for the plot in it and the rationale, and this person that this other crewman killed, they must have done wrong to you. He couldn't accept that the killer simply said, I didn't like the way he looked at me. That was just irrational for Tuvok. And he goes down, he does a mind meld with the killer, and he goes down this really dark path that was a tour de force for Tim Russ, I thought. He did a great job with it. But that was, and that was a very, it wasn't a very plot heavy show at all. It was very talky. I could not have written that episode, even though I came up with the story. I was such a new writer. I don't think I could have written like 60 pages of characters talking to each other. I would have wanted to throw in a space battle or something. And Michael did a wonderful, wonderful job with it. But that's one of the few times that it works. More often than not, you'll come up with a premise, a concept, and then like in the back of your mind will be like, well, this might be a way of talking about this, something that's going on in the world, something that is important to me, a Bill of Rights or whatever it is you want to talk about. Generally, that I find is a better way. But often you'll end up writing shows that they might be terrific shows, they might be entertaining, they may not work on any deeper level, in a political sense, whatever that means exactly. But if they work on a character level, or in terms of Star Trek, also as good science fiction. Generally, you've entertained the audience, but if you can get that extra something, make it about something without being pretentious, as Coppola said. That's the dream. That's the victory. It's hard to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and rewatching this episode, Mike, did you feel as though the allegory of the episode was too heavy-handed? Because I know I've read a couple of quotes, and I don't know if they're correctly attributed to you, but you've said in the past that this episode was unsuccessful insofar as the allegory was really on the nose. Is that something that you still see in that episode? Do you kind of cringe when you look at it? Because you shouldn't be so hard on yourself, given the existence of the Omega Glory, where the one with
I knew you were going to
Shatner
go there.
reciting the preamble, or
Right.
Last Battlefield with the alien species that's half black, half white, which are,
Right.
are really quite obvious in terms of what they're saying. So
Sure.
in that respect, don't be so hard on yourself if that is in fact the case. But do you still kind of cringe when you see this episode?
I'm trying to remember what I might have said in the past about it. Having just rewatched it, I enjoyed it more than I
Yeah.
thought I would, because I think I was just, again, you're taking the experience of, it's hard to separate the experience of the making and the writing of something from just sitting back as a viewer. But you can sit back after, I mean, I found myself caught up in it. Like, oh, I didn't know what was going to happen next. It was
Yeah.
it's a very strange place to be. But yeah, I don't know. It was probably more successful than I thought, but I do remember a lot of struggles with, trying to find a deeper meaning. And again, the struggle is to keep it entertaining as well. Like, for instance, there was a lot. I did look at some of the notes from the room for the writers when we were all talking about the premise and what was working and what wasn't. And I was just kind of scanning through it. And it was fun to jump back in time 24 years or however long it was, and being in that room with Brannon and Chris Black and all those other writers. And the struggle, if I recall, was from the notes, is that we were trying to make it less on the nose and try and have this story exist in a little more gray area. Clearly, this was a bad thing that was going on this planet to these very nice people. How do you make the Dean Stockwell character not a total black hat? And he was somewhat sympathetic. We could have gone another direction with it. I think the episode ends, for instance, on I think what we tried to make that a gray area where we don't know what's going to happen to these people. They may get pulled out of here. We may free them, and now they end up being drafted into this Suliban cabal and become foot soldiers in this war, who will then show up again, and we might have to kill these people. That's very dark. That's also very interesting. And that story has been done in various ways before. But not to say we couldn't have done something, really interesting with that ultimately. And so the episode actually ends on that sort of darker note. Like, we don't know what's going to happen to these people, but at least they're in charge of their own destiny.
Yep.
They're free from this place. But where they will go, what they will do, it was left open-ended, and I don't believe we ever revisited those particular characters to find out what happened to them. But I do think there could have been a way to thread a little more ambiguity through the story. But again, we called it right out in the episode itself. This has happened on Earth before, we said, and sure, sadly it has, and continues to.
It continues to. And, so in real life, as in Star Trek or any other art form, whether it's television, movies, painting even, it's a question of finding the balance between exposition and drama. And it is, things like this are still happening. And I mean, personally, I've had the ambiguity on which the episode ended was very powerful. Because of course, I would have loved for it to have been revisited at some point, because we have seen instances in which Germany after World War I, for example, look what happened there. So we're in a similar situation where we are sort of on the brink of something, don't really know what's going to happen, which has tremendous dramatic potential. But again, airing too much on that side isn't very good either.
Yeah.
And Bob and I have talked a lot about this too. The trend in Star Trek right now towards that end of the spectrum. And I'm just curious what you think of how that's unfolding in shows like Discovery, Picard, and Strange New Worlds.
Well, I'm sorry, when you say unfolding in that direction, I'm not sure I understand.
The emphasis is on the drama, sometimes at the expense of the conversations and the more diplomatic aspects, the more
Oh,
exploring aspects of Star Trek.
right. Well, it's interesting. I love how you look at the original designs when they were conceiving of Star Trek: The Next Generation, and you look at the original designs of the bridge, and instead of a captain's chair flanked by his first officer and the counselor, there was a conference room table there,
Oh wow.
which is really, and in fact, it kind of fit into that horseshoe shape. It was, and so it was. They basically took the conference room, which they later moved behind the bridge in its own separate room. That was going to be where the show happened.
Hmm.
Now, I think they were very wise to make that change, but that was very interesting to me. That at least had been, I assume, one of Gene Roddenberry's earlier instincts. In developing that show and how it was going to be different from the original series. I mean, again, I kind of go back to the writing of it. Space battles are actually very boring to write. They're fun to watch, with music and special effects. I often find myself sitting back and just being like, "Oh wow, that looked cool. I didn't think that would look that neat." They're no fun to write, really, very rarely.
Yeah.
The mechanics of it or the plot of it can be fun to figure out. So. I think, Star Trek has always been it's always been a very talky show.
Mhm.
I think that's why the movies, by and large, as much as I love so many of them, and even the ones I don't love are like, cold pizza. I'll still, consume them ravenously. But, I think, getting back to the theme of allegory and coming up with interesting themes to discuss. I mean, it's sort of Star Trek's superpower that, the brilliance of the premise is that it can be political, but not necessarily partisan or preaching at its best. And it's kind of this safe space to have those conversations about, war and civil rights and, race relations. And it is no secret, I think, that the show more often than not, is not really about the future. It is about, here and now and what is going on in the world here and now. And Star Trek, the way the characters solve problems by talking through them and figuring them out and not shooting something, I think that's always been part of the appeal of the series. So I don't know that I've seen enough of all the new shows to make that judgment that they have done less of that. I've certainly seen episodes where I think where they have leaned into that Roddenberry philosophy. But I mean, even I remember when Star Trek II came out, there were people, there were fans, we were old kids who, as much as they loved the original series, felt that the movie was kind of a shoot 'em up and didn't really have anything to say that was important. And was this going to be the future of Star Trek? I think the fact that Star Trek fans have been having that conversation for decades, to me, is fascinating. And I think every series, to one degree or another, leans in a different direction. I think Enterprise, when it first started, we thought that show was going to be more about exploration. And 9/11, wham, that hit us like a ton of bricks the first month we were on the air. And the show evolved because of it.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that too. I was going to ask about the atmosphere in the writer's room, as opposed to what things were like on Voyager, which you worked on.
Mm-hmm.
What were the differences between working on Voyager and working on Enterprise? One pre 9/11, one post 9/11. Seems like it may have been night and day, right?
It was in many ways. It was and it wasn't. I think certainly as 9/11 really the repercussions of it, because we were all sort of just like shell shocked about the world, but I think the entertainment industry was also not quite knowing how to deal with it. It certainly felt like this was going on right now. It was certainly too soon to talk about it, but what was there else to talk about, quite frankly? And that was kind of the conundrum I think we felt in the writers' room. And of course, that didn't exist on Voyager because this, history had not happened yet. And if I recall, I don't know that there was ever an actual decision or moment, but I think we felt, and this is probably borne out by the episodes we did in season 1 and season 2 to a degree, to stay the course, that this was a show that is optimistic at its heart, and that certainly in this time of crisis, people are going to turn to Star Trek more than they might have in the past, for some sense of hope for tomorrow and the future, and we'll all be able to get along. So we decided to stay the course, and after a certain amount of time had passed, the decision was made to do a storyline that was a direct analog for what had happened, and that led to a whole interconnected 24 episode season that was in many ways a triumph for the show and the franchise. I've never really done that before. It was really hard to do. But I think ultimately it was successful, and it was necessary. I think it was.
Yeah, so segueing now into your foray back into the Star Trek universe with this pitch that everyone's talking about, which is Star Trek United, about Jonathan Archer's early days as president of the Federation. Mike, it's as if you created this idea for Mary and me and the existence of this entire podcast, because it's kind of in our wheelhouse. You know what I mean? Sure. For those of us who are watching right now, who are unfamiliar with the Star Trek United pitch, just recap your overall concept for this thing that you and Scott Bakula are working on.
Well, I had reached out to Scott about 2.5 years ago about another project, and in an email, and I was sort of joking with him in that email, how soon are we going to see Star Trek Archer on Paramount Plus? Because Star Trek Picard had premiered not long before. And before I hit send on that email, I stopped, and I was like, Star Trek Archer, like, what would that be? And then I remembered I'd planted this seed in an episode years earlier that had established that Archer, his legacy included being president of the Federation. And it suddenly occurred, like, oh my God, that's a television show. So I immediately changed the email. Instead of making it a joke, I talked to him about these other things I wanted to discuss with him, but also, oh, and by the way, I have this idea for a new Star Trek series. If maybe you're into it, where you're a president. What do you think? So, and so that idea ultimately ended up being pitched to the powers that be at Paramount and Secret Hideout, and they were very receptive to it. Now, I didn't have a full pitch, because there was sort of no point in fleshing out a big 20-minute presentation with graphics and everything if the idea of it was not something they were necessarily interested in. So it was just really kind of this overview of what it would be. However, Scott and I, before I could get to that point, Scott wanted to know a lot more details about it before I could even pitch it to Paramount. So I actually did have to work it out in a lot more detail than I probably would have, rather than simply, calling them and saying, hey, do you guys think you'd be interested in something like this? So, so that was sort of the genesis of it. And I think, for me, it's kind of it just fits. It just makes sense. Star Trek has always been about smart, dedicated people from diverse backgrounds, pulling together to tackle these impossible problems. And I think instead of, being at the helm of a starship, imagines Jonathan Archer steering the ship of state of the Federation. And wow. I think there are a lot of really interesting story possibilities. So, and I think fans of the original show, Enterprise, would be very interested in this direction. This is not a sequel to the show. They're not jumping on another ship by any means. I'd love to see as much of that cast as we could get from time to time. And I think there are a lot of really rich stories to tell about that time in the history of Star Trek and the Federation. It's hard for me not to think of Star Trek as this future history,
Mm-hmm.
and to look at, the corners of it, or the gaps in time where we haven't seen the adventures. We don't know what really happened there. And sometimes a part of my brain will click in and be like, well, what if? What happened during the 100 years between Enterprise, where we saw Archer literally at the ceremony where the Federation was founded, and 100 years later when Discovery comes in? That's a big block of time. And very little is known about it. And the fact that it is those formative years of the Federation, that's what's exciting. Maybe the show could exist in a different era, but in those early years, I think you could again, through allegory, talk about what this country, for one, went through after its founding, after the revolution, in that period of time before, when you had the Articles of Confederation, which were clearly not working, and the the establishment of the actual Constitution 10, 15 years later. I think that, finding analogs for that and having a character like Archer brought in, called upon to save this organization that was falling apart. I don't know. I want to see that show, quite frankly. I kind of don't want to write it. I just want to watch it.
Yeah, I
Same,
love this
yeah.
idea so much that I wish I didn't know about it, because I'm guessing it's not going to happen next month. And that's sort of nerd torture. But it sounds fascinating in part, as you say, because it fills in a part of the narrative that is missing. As you say, with so little information about that intervening century. Plus, it works historically on so many levels. Yes, the founding of the United States, but the founding of the UN and NATO, post World War II world order. So having it in this format, I think, will free you up to do all sorts of incredible things. And I'm guessing we just don't know yet if, and certainly not when, it's going to happen.
Yeah, I think, this show in many ways is, it's got a lot of parallels, I suppose, with Deep Space Nine, in that it would not be set on Earth, it would not be set on a starship, but it would be set in deep space on this planet, Babel, that we heard about in the original series, which was the center of, interstellar diplomacy. One of the great lessons I took from the television series Andor, I don't know if you can see my shirt here. Is this phrase familiar?
Oh yeah.
Was that, the big question, I think, for the creators of Andor, for Tony Gilroy, was, could you do a Star Wars series that didn't have anything to do with Force users and Jedi and Baby Yoda, and tell something that felt, pertinent to that world? And I think the Star Trek universe, in many ways, is even more vast than the Star Wars universe. I'm a big fan of both. And that certainly there are, billions upon billions of people who have never been on a starship, or never gone through a temporal anomaly, or encountered anything, really very strange. They must have very interesting lives in this future. I think in many ways we know much more about, the inner workings of the Klingon Empire or the Romulan Empire, or than we do about the Federation itself, which is interesting. I think and I think there were very good reasons for leaving the Federation kind of mysterious, just as in the original series, they never went back to Earth, didn't talk much about it. They go back to Earth in time travel stories, but they never went back to like future Earth for many reasons, budget being one of them. But I don't know. I feel like there's been so much. That world exists. That world is built, and we still just don't know so much about how it works, why it works. And I just think the mechanics of that, figuring that out, working with writers who perhaps worked in government. A lot of them, as I understand it, are unemployed these days, so they might be available, sadly. But it just seems like such a great arena to tell Star Trek type stories.
Yeah, you mentioned Andor, and I was thinking about this in terms of tone for this series. with Andor on sort of the bleak end of the spectrum and the West Wing on the more hopeful end of the spectrum, a more idealistic end of the spectrum, where do you see United landing there? Maybe right in between, or leaning more toward West Wing, or leaning more toward Andor in overall tone?
I mean, I think it ultimately, I mean, look, Andor ended with a movie where everybody died at the end. They all died for a good cause.
Yes.
Pretty bleak.
Mm-hmm.
I think the best Star Trek is optimistic and hopeful at heart. And even if, I mean, I imagine, Archer coming into this job, the Federation may not be in the greatest place, but I think ultimately the stories we would tell would be one of, because we also, as the audience, we know where it's all going. That the Federation will continue, and that he will ultimately be successful. So for me, this is a story really about hope and optimism, and not necessarily thinking of the Federation as a utopia or a paradise, which they sometimes say in the show, but that it's a work in progress. And certainly in this era, it would be a work in progress. And it is an analog, or would be, I think, for our own messy democracy. But to see it through this lens of, we can get through this, we can get past this. This is how these fictional people and these fictional aliens might do it. Is there something we can take from that? And I think because it is fiction, because it's science fiction and set in the future, it doesn't trigger people really. You can forget all the labels and the partisanship and just not necessarily you're taking a lesson from it, but you can see how the characters figure things out, and is there a way we can apply that to our own lives, our own democracy, our own way of dealing with each other? That's the hope.
Yeah.
That sounds incredible. I think that as much as I continue to love all things Star Trek, I do think that we could use a little bit more optimism in the current incarnations of Star Trek. And because what we know is that the Federation and Starfleet and humanity as a whole have figured out some things that we're still struggling to figure out on present day Earth.
Right.
And it's more about the struggles of the individual and figuring out how to work with other races that approach things differently, not about the problems of humanity. So that's one of the things that has always drawn me to Star Trek, and having that as the show's premise sounds just fascinating and really exciting to me. Because again, Bob and I are sort of old school in our love of the working through of things and allowing space to have those deep philosophical conversations.
And along those lines, just going back to what you were saying about figuring things out, and that whole idea as sort of a central tenet of this series is being a presidency nerd. My area of concentration in my political science degree was the American presidency, and I was really into this as an idea. And the idea of stopping and starting with the Articles of Confederation and then scrapping that and coming up with the Constitution in its wake. The idea of the presidency alone as a construct in the Federation, it seems to be as if that would be something that's kind of controversial insofar as the presidential system tends to notoriously become a dictatorship. Every time the United States exports or influences an emerging democracy to adopt a presidential system, those nascent democracies end up becoming dictatorships more often than not. So the idea of not just challenges in terms of organizing the Federation itself, but the challenges of being the president of the Federation with maybe some warnings coming from other circles saying, well, you know what, we can't have this presidency because we don't know. Is there going to be dictator Archer? Is Jonathan Archer going to become, this authoritarian leader rather than one in charge of a sort of a UN style democracy? So these are all things that would be just utterly fascinating to explore from just a very basic nuts and bolts nation building or federation building aspect. And so I'm sure these are all things that you've been thinking about, and it must be really tantalizing to have an idea like this on deck and not know if it's going to go forward. Are you constantly going back to this as building it out?
Well, I'm going to blame both of you actually for all of this. Quite frankly, this
Cool.
discussion. So it's to your credit. So our mutual friend Mark Altman, we were
Yes.
on our way to a writers' conference a couple months ago, and he mentioned this panel, and I had known about it the year before, and had listened to your podcast version of it, and it was very entertaining. And he suggested I'd be on your panel, and I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that could be fun. And he said, well, and you could talk about your Star Trek United idea, because Mark was someone I chatted with and shared it with, and he was the one who initially hooked me up with certain people at Paramount who he had a better relationship with to get in there and chat with them about it. And so, but I wanted to talk to Scott first, because again, this was something that was like in our past. This was in the rearview mirror. He and I had talked about it very intensely and had worked out a lot of it. And then there was a very general meeting with Secret Hideout regarding it. But that was all in the rearview mirror. I wasn't thinking about the show anymore or this pitch. And when I ended up, I did an interview with one of the Trek movie sites, and they asked me about it, and I told them a little more, and it just kind of snowballed. Unlike anything I've worked on before. I mean, when I worked on Star Trek in the past, social media was not really a thing yet. And even worse, this is sort of the blessing and the curse. I can't get it out of my head, and it's not just the idea of it. It is story ideas and possibilities and scenes and characters who would appear and how they would appear. And which I kind of want to talk about, but also don't want to talk about because it was because I had said, yeah, sure, that'd be fun to do a politics panel with Bob and Mary, that it kind of came out. So thank you, and
damn you.
I wouldn't say damn, but no, it's great fun. One of the people I caught up with at the convention was Michael Taylor, who you may know has written some brilliant episodes of Deep Space and Voyager. And he hasn't written for these shows in over 20 years, and he tells me he gets ideas for like a new Star Trek series. They just kind of pop into your head. It's hard to let go of that franchise if you have any interest in those people and those characters in that setting. So we'll see what happens. I would love nothing more. I'm encouraged. You see, or at least I do, press releases, and it sounds like the new regime at Paramount wants to do a lot more Star Trek. So maybe something like this could be a part of it at some point. We shall see.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, as soon
we'll
as
do
you
what
know,
we can. Yeah.
please let us know. And everybody watching, I don't know. What do we write letters to Paramount? How does this work? What is the best way to move the needle here?
That's a good question. Do people still write letters? If that seems like too much trouble, then I guess write an email, on social media or something. Talk about it.
I do know that not only are you on this show this week, but you're also on All Access Star Trek with our friends Laurie Ulster and Tony Pascal. So it's there's going to be a lot of attention paid toward Star Trek United and your work on that with Scott. And so hopefully between both shows, there'll be some spotlight on this idea and maybe get some additional attention now that the big Skydance merger has gone through, and maybe they're looking to greenlight some more projects. So we're putting good vibes out for this, Mike. Absolutely.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. And, the more we can, pound the drum for, meaningful television, meaningful stories, meaningful Star Trek that has something to say, but isn't pretentious.
Although maybe sometimes it's pretentious, and that's okay because it's Star Trek.
Right.
You got to have Archer reciting the Constitution, the preamble to the Constitution, at least once.
E plebnista. Hey, that's the only reason I can memorize.
E plebnista. That's right. And then after he goes into the huge speech, the guy goes, "I do not fully understand." You mean after all of that, the music and everything, you still don't understand, you idiot? Thank you again, Mike, for joining us today and talking about this project, which, again, we're all putting in some elbow grease to try to push it uphill and get it greenlit, just because we so desperately want to see it. But and thank you for all of the amazing work you've done on Star Trek over all these years. And we hope to see you back in the captain's chair again and guiding this next one through. We're just going to assume that it's going to happen. I'm just going to take that approach from now on.
We're manifesting.
Well, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you again.
I appreciate it. Thank you, guys.
Right.
Great.
Thank you, Mike. It's great to have you. That was fascinating. And
Yes.
I know, Bob, you have some interesting observations about what happened
Yes.
to Detain.
No ocular migraine in this episode. I was grateful to see that. And, you know,
Yeah.
it's not my all-time favorite Enterprise episode, but I like its classic Star Trek setup. We've seen this many times where members of the crew end up in some sort of weird prison and they have to work their way out of it. Plus, I always like episodes that feature Ensign Mayweather, who's one of my favorite characters on Enterprise. And my absolute favorite character on Enterprise, Dr. Phlox, is sadly minimal in this episode. I think the great John Billingsley only appears in one shot in this episode. And hopefully we'll be able to talk to John on the show later this year or early next year. So the episode reunites, as we said, Scott Bakula and Dean Stockwell. Stockwell plays Colonel Grat, is his name, the commander of the detention complex. And I found this from Memory Alpha, Mary. Executive producer Rick Berman remembered, quote, "We always thought it would be fun to get the two of them together," Scott Bakula, Dean Stockwell. "And I spoke to Scott and he thought it would be a great idea. Stockwell was delighted to do it. It was a lot of fun. I hear he didn't want to use a whole lot of prosthetic face makeup, so they've got that one little patch in between their eyes, sort of in the Bajoran zone of their faces. So that was Stockwell's involvement in this episode. But this episode aired in April 2002, which was just 4 months after George W. Bush began indefinitely detaining suspected terrorists at Guantanamo Bay. So it was a little bit prescient. It was in that pocket of time that we all remember tragically. And according to Memory Alpha, this is so bizarre, Rick Berman came up with the name Suliban based on Taliban.
Oh, wow.
But he did it prior to 9/11. So he did.
wow.
It was several months before 9/11 actually happened. So once again, it seems like Star Trek is always like one step ahead of history, one step ahead of the timeline of events that we're going through. This episode features the amazing Dennis Christopher, who was famously in the movie Breaking Away, my favorite cycling movie of all time. And in fact, every time I see him on screen, and he's been in several Star Trek episodes, a voice in my head always goes, "Refund, refund," which is one of the famous lines from Breaking Away. That's just a nerdy cycling thing that I always notice.
It's also my favorite cycling movie, by the way.
It's just absolutely wonderful. If you want to know how great cycling is, just watch Dennis Christopher riding his bike down these country roads. This is just what it's all about. Anyway, T'Pol in this episode reminds Archer about his pledge to not interfere with other cultures. And that's years before General Order 1, aka the Prime Directive. So Archer says he's making an exception in this episode to this just personal pledge, beginning, of course, a long tradition of Starfleet captains bending the Prime Directive, whether it's written or unwritten. And finally, Mayweather really, really hates the food in this detention camp. He complains about it on a couple of occasions, which makes perfect sense because it looks like really, really chunky oatmeal, or kind of like the skin texture of the Suliban. For some reason,
as you can see
thought
here.
initially, yeah. Are they grinding up Suliban and making the oatmeal out of their skin or something? Is this really kind of...
Did you really have to make it worse than it already was? My God.
Yeah. But it provides, I think, a little teeny tiny bit of comic relief in a very, very serious episode. And also, just to be clear, Malcolm Reed, played by the great Dominic Keating, also has a couple of jokes in there because he ends up getting disguised as a Suliban and he's complaining about his skin itching. And so that's some of the things
I'm desperately
I observed
hoping
in
he
this
doesn't
episode.
get turned into food. I think that's
Exactly. He doesn't want to get turned into the disgusting oatmeal that Mayweather hates so much.
the cruel. Okay,
Yes.
so that was It was also, I agree, not the best Enterprise episode, but as with Star Trek sometimes, and as we discussed with Mike, it's hard to find the balance of exposition and dramatic tension. But I think excellent points were made. So next week, Bob and I will be discussing the Next Generation episode, Drumhead, which is episode 21 of season 4. So please check that out. It's always helpful if you watch it ahead of time. And I think that's also, given the times in which we live, going to be yet another fascinating discussion. So we're really looking forward to that. Bob, I will see you then.
See you then, Mary.
Okay.